Welcome back. South Africa's declining economy has forced many to tighten their belts, but for domestic workers this is even harder, and if you're a pregnant domestic worker it's next to impossible. While there is legislation in place to provide maternity protection benefits, many are struggling to access it. Currently 12% of working women in the country are domestic workers. Let's unpack this further. I'm joined by the University of the Western Cape's Catherine Pereira-Kotze. She joins us now virtually just to give us more. Catherine, thank you very much for your time here on eNCA. Of course, this is quite concerning, and obviously these women are opting not to take the maternity leave because they still need to make money, and their job is a pay-as-you-work kind of job, right? So they are between a rock and a hard place.
Definitely. Thanks very much for having me, Masego, to speak about this important issue. And as you said, domestic workers, it's no work, no pay. So even though we have legislation that says that women should get 4 months of maternity leave around the time of childbirth, because the mechanism to ensure that that leave is paid is so complicated, many domestic workers are unable to take that leave and unable to access cash payments. So in South Africa, we have a national social insurance scheme called the Unemployment Insurance Fund, where employers and workers are meant to contribute 1% of the monthly income to the fund. And domestic workers who work 24 hours a month or more are eligible to apply for that. However, there are many challenges from workers and employers with registering for the fund, with contributing to the fund, and then claiming from the fund, where we hear many stories of women only able to access the UIF benefits months after they've delivered their child, and in the meantime they've had to go back to work to get an income. So there's many challenges and it's quite complex.
And of course now this also messes up on their pockets as well, because if for instance you're a domestic worker, you are pregnant and you give birth to your child and you have to continue going to work, it means that you might have to also spend money on someone who's looking after your child over and above the little that you take home.
Definitely. And I mean, part of the purpose of maternity protection is to allow women to recover physically from childbirth, to care for their newborn babies, to establish breastfeeding. And when women are going back to work as early as 2 weeks, some domestic workers report to returning to work because they simply cannot afford to not be earning an income. They have to now find somebody to look after a small baby. Many creches don't accept babies as young as a few months old. They only accept babies from 6 months onwards. And women end up paying most of their income to childcare and to the transport that it costs them to get to work. And it's, as I mentioned, it's difficult to find childcare for such young babies. And then also we know that when women return to work, it becomes very difficult to continue breastfeeding, especially for domestic workers who are traveling far distances from where they live to where they work. And I'd like to speak a bit about some of the challenges that women experience in combining work and breastfeeding. And again, related to income, if a woman is not breastfeeding, that means that she needs to now buy formula, which is extremely expensive and unaffordable, as well as a suboptimal product for the majority of the population.
And now, it's so sad because domestic work is so prone to abuse because of the people who might, you might fall into the wrong hands in terms of the person who employs you. But it's also a desperate situation for some people to be able to just put food on the table, etc. But where can, domestic workers go to report? I'm sure you can report, the flouting of labor laws against your employer for not at least giving you those benefits for maternity leave, right?
So one of the, organizations is there are actually unions for domestic workers, but it's quite a difficult sector for the unions to represent. Many domestic workers don't even know about the unions. So there's a union called SADSAWU, based in the Western Cape, but representing members nationally as well. There's ISWI Domestic Worker Alliance, and there's UDOSA. And we can share information about these unions. They have a bit of knowledge on what the ramifications are and how to mediate against if domestic workers are not accessing the rights that they should be. But also because, as you mentioned, domestic work is kind of vulnerable, it's difficult, it takes place in individual households where employers are individuals that might not be familiar with the laws. Employers also need to realize that they have certain responsibilities. If they are going to employ somebody, they need to find out what the obligations are for them in providing employment benefits like leave. Many domestic workers report to not even getting any type of paid leave, whether it's sick leave, annual leave, maternity leave. And this is a situation that we need to start changing, and we need to start making the working environment supportive of women, especially around the time of pregnancy and childbirth, which is a vulnerable time for women and their health and the development of their children. So there's a lot that can be done by employers, by society in general, and firstly to become familiar with the recommendations. So one example is that the Basic Conditions of Employment Act has a code of good practice for breastfeeding and pregnant women. And one of the recommendations is that when women return to work, they should be able to access breaks to breastfeed or express their breast milk while they're at work so that their children can carry on being breastfed. But many people in all settings, especially domestic workers, don't even know, they haven't heard about this concept of breastfeeding breaks. So just for all of us to start familiarizing ourselves with the policies and legislation that exists and doing what we can to contribute to supporting these working women.
So then I guess, Catherine, that is why you see some people starting businesses to try and formalize the industry, where they'd have sort of an agency for domestic workers so that they get their monthly payments and all those benefits that come with labor law, right?
Yes, there are some agencies, but there's also challenges with the agencies as well, because often the agency describes that they are providing a platform to access work, and they're not always contributing to the unemployment insurance fund because it becomes quite complicated. They're not directly employing that domestic worker. And this is where domestic workers form part of a group that we refer to as non-standard workers, and they are particularly vulnerable to not receiving many labor and social protections because they kind of fall through the cracks, as it were. The responsibility of who is it the platform's responsibility? Is it the household employing the domestic worker's responsibility? It becomes quite complicated. But there are ways that we can simplify this, and there are certain benefits that are easy and should be relatively easy to provide, like opportunity to have a breastfeeding or an expressing break, like making sure that a pregnant woman isn't expected to do work that could be physically hazardous to her or her newborn baby, and like making attempts to contribute to the National Insurance Fund so that women are able to claim some portion of their salary when they're on maternity leave.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle, really, what you've just described. Thank you so much for speaking to us. And I like the advice that you give, that even you as an employer individually in your home, maybe you should familiarize yourself with the laws around it so you protect yourself as well from possibly being sued if something happens to your domestic worker and he or she has the right connections to get you into trouble.